All right, so today we're going deep into this world where you can basically trade stocks that don't even exist.
Yeah, these phantom shares.
Phantom shares, exactly. And our guide for this is Dr. Susanne Trimbath,
Yes, Dr. Trimbath.
this economist who Wall Street has nicknamed Queen Kong.
You know, she's earned that nickname. She really has. She's been fighting for retail investors and taking on these giants of finance for years.
And what I think is so interesting is how she connects this whole GameStop saga, which, a lot of people just dismissed as like, oh, this meme stock frenzy.
Right.
But she
Yeah.
connects it to this much deeper systemic problem.
Yeah, GameStop was just the tip of the iceberg, really. It exposed these cracks in the system that were already there. But Dr. Trimbath has been sounding the alarm on phantom shares for decades now.
Yeah, she has. And she really argues that the average investor is playing a rigged game. And today, we're going to try to understand why.
Absolutely. And she does it by breaking down these really complex concepts like nobody else can. I mean, she's brilliant.
Okay, so let's start with this term that gets thrown around a lot. Failure to deliver.
Yeah, or FTD.
FTD, right?
So imagine you buy a book online, right? The money's taken out of your account,
Okay,
but the book never shows up.
right.
That's basically what happens with an FTD, but instead of a book, it's a share of stock.
So someone is selling me something they don't even possess.
Yeah, essentially.
Okay, that's already shady.
Yeah, it can be.
But how does this connect to naked short selling? Because I hear that term thrown around a lot.
Right, so think of it this way. Short selling is like borrowing your friend's car
Okay.
and then selling it, hoping to buy it back later at a lower price so you can return it to your friend and pocket the difference.
Okay.
Naked short selling is selling that car without ever borrowing it in the first place.
Wait, so they're selling something that's not even theirs to sell?
Exactly.
That sounds completely illegal.
It is in many cases, and it creates these phantom shares. So
Yeah.
suddenly there are more shares of a company floating around than actually exist.
Like duplicate keys to that car?
Right, like duplicate keys to a car that your friend doesn't even know you sold.
Oh, that's such a good analogy.
And it gets even crazier because Dr. Trimbath says it can take longer to receive a share of a popular stock than to sell a house.
That's insane.
It really is.
Yeah.
It highlights just how distorted the system has become.
So how long has this been going on? Because it sounds like this isn't a new problem.
Oh, it's definitely not new. Dr. Trimbath has been onto this for a long time. In fact, back in 1993, she noticed something fishy.
Okay.
Companies were getting more votes at shareholder meetings than the number of shares they had actually issued.
Wait, more votes than shares? How's
Yeah.
that even possible?
Right. It's like finding out more people voted in an election than are even registered to vote.
Yeah.
And Dr. Trimbath connects this back to those phantom shares. More shares floating around means the potential for more votes, even if those shares technically don't exist.
So she called this whole system proxy plumbing,
Yes.
which is how these votes are counted in this really twisted way that just disenfranchises the average investor.
Yeah.
So she noticed this back in 93.
Mm-hmm.
And did anyone even take her seriously?
Not really, unfortunately. You know, a lot of people just dismissed her concerns.
Of course.
But then by 2003, she was working with an investor who was seeing the same problem, but on a massive scale.
Wow.
Yeah, we're talking billions of dollars.
So this wasn't just some isolated incident.
Right. It was a pattern, a systemic issue within the market itself.
And this is where it gets even more interesting because there's a specific example that Dr. Trimbath talks about,
Yeah.
a small Canadian mining company called Barker Minerals.
Oh, yes.
And they were able to prove they were victims of this very scheme.
Yes. Barker Minerals, they meticulously tracked and traced those phantom shares. They even developed a strategy called prolonged strategy to really expose what was going on.
So they used publicly available data to basically prove this was happening.
Exactly.
And they had concrete proof.
Yes, but even with solid evidence, the Canadian regulators weren't interested in pursuing the issue.
So they basically got away with it.
Pretty much. It's a classic example of a system that's rigged against the little guy.
Ugh, it's so frustrating. But this is where I think Dr. Trimbath's tenacity really shines. Because she doesn't just point out the problems, she offers solutions.
Right, she's a problem solver.
Yeah.
And her solutions are actually shockingly straightforward.
Okay. Like what?
Well, first, no more waivers on penalties for failing to deliver shares. Then hefty fines for those who do.
Okay.
Mandatory buy-ins when shares aren't delivered, and kicking repeat offenders out of the system altogether.
It sounds almost too simple.
Right.
Why hasn't anyone implemented these measures yet?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And this leads us to another one of Dr. Trimbath's major criticisms.
Which is?
The way Wall Street is regulated, or rather, self-regulated.
Wait, you mean Wall Street is essentially policing itself?
Yeah, pretty much. It's like the fox guarding the henhouse. And Dr. Trimbath points to the revolving door between regulators and the financial industry. Regulators often come from Wall Street and then they return there after their government stints.
So the people who are supposed to be protecting investors are often the same ones who benefited from this flawed system.
Yeah, it's a real conflict of
This
interest.
is outrageous.
Dr. Trimbath doesn't mince words. She calls it a suicide pact between Washington and Wall Street.
Wow.
But, she also offers a more charitable interpretation, what she calls the incompetence hypothesis.
Incompetence meaning?
Meaning the system might be so complex that even the regulators don't fully understand it.
Oh, wow.
And if that's the case, how can they possibly protect investors?
It's a chilling thought, and it kind of circles back to this whole proxy plumbing issue.
Yeah,
It seems intentionally designed to be so opaque
it does.
that the average investor is just left in the dark.
Right, and Dr. Trimbath believes this lack of transparency in vote counting really silences retail investors. They think they're voting, but their votes are effectively discarded because of all these phantom shares.
And this is happening on a massive scale.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
She points to the example of Broadridge,
Right.
a company that handles proxy voting for tons of companies. They actually bragged about tossing out 7 billion votes in a single year.
7 billion.
7 billion with a B.
That's mind-boggling.
It really is. And Dr. Trimbath believes many of those discarded votes belong to retail investors who are completely unaware.
So it's basically a system designed to keep them in the dark.
Yeah, pretty much.
So with all this going on, what can the average investor even do? It feels like we're up against a brick wall.
Well, don't despair.
Okay.
One of the most important things is simply being aware of these issues. Knowledge is power. Dr. Trimbath wants investors to understand how the market really works, including all the risks involved.
Right.
And she's also a big advocate for direct registration of shares, or DRS.
DRS.
Yes, exactly. DRSing your shares gives you more control and transparency over your holdings.
So DRS is one tool,
Yeah,
but it sounds like real change has to come from the regulatory level.
absolutely. Dr. Trimbath argues that regulators need to take a much stronger stance against naked short selling and failures to deliver. Her 4-step plan is a great place to start.
Now, I've also heard that the European Union is actually ahead of the U.S. in addressing these issues.
They are. They have something called the Central Securities Depositories Regulation, or CSDR, which includes mandatory buy-ins and penalties for failing to deliver shares.
Wow.
It's a much stricter approach than we have here in the U.S.
It's amazing to see Dr. Trimbath working on this issue at a global level.
It really is.
And it's crazy to think this all started with her just noticing a discrepancy in vote counts back in 1993.
It speaks to her dedication to uncovering the truth and fighting for fairness.
Yes, she could have easily ignored the problem and just, enjoyed a comfortable career in finance.
Right.
But she chose to speak truth to power, even when it made her enemies in high places.
She did, and that's what makes her so inspiring.
It really does. She's a true advocate for the little guy.
Absolutely. Dr. Trimbath isn't just uncovering problems, she's finding solutions.
Right.
That gives me hope.
Okay.
Hope that even a system as complex and seemingly impenetrable as Wall Street can be reformed to be fairer and more transparent for everyone.
Her commitment to educating the public about these issues is equally important, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. She breaks down these really complicated mechanics of finance in a way that anyone can understand.
Yeah.
She uses clear language, relatable examples. It's a rare gift in a field that's known for jargon and obfuscation.
She really is the people's economist,
Yes, she is.
breaking down these complex systems and empowering investors with knowledge.
Exactly. And she does it all with this dry wit and humor.
Yeah.
You can tell she genuinely enjoys unraveling these mysteries and sharing what she learns with the world.
Now, I've heard her book, Naked, Short, and Greedy, is a good place to start for anyone wanting to learn more about all this.
Oh, absolutely. It's a deep dive into this world packed with information and analysis, but it's written in a way that's engaging and accessible.
Okay, good.
A must-read for anyone who cares about the integrity of our financial markets.
So, listener, if you're as fascinated by this as we are, we highly recommend checking out Dr. Trimbath's work. It's eye-opening, empowering, and, yes, even a little bit entertaining.
I couldn't agree more. Dr. Trimbath's work is a testament to the power of knowledge and persistence. She's a shining example of how one person can make a real difference even when facing what seem like insurmountable odds.
And that's what makes her work so inspiring. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in holding these powerful institutions accountable.
Absolutely. Dr. Trimbath's work is a call to action, challenging each of us to become more informed, more engaged, and to demand a fairer and more transparent financial system.
And that's a mission worth fighting for.
Without a doubt, Dr. Trimbath is a true pioneer in this fight, shining a light on those dark corners of Wall Street. Her work is paving the way for a brighter and more equitable future for all investors.
And on that note, we'll wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into the work of Dr. Susanne Trimbath. Join us next time as we continue to explore her insights into the world of naked short-selling failures to deliver and the fight for market integrity.
Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a fair system. Now, you might be thinking, okay, if a company knows it's being harmed by these phantom shares, they'd speak up, right?
Yeah, it seems like it'd be in their best interest to protect themselves and their investors.
You'd think so, but Dr. Trimbath argues it's not that simple. Companies often face immense pressure from Wall Street to stay silent.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Remember, the financial industry holds a lot of sway over the economy and public perception.
So they're basically afraid to speak out for fear of retaliation.
Exactly. There's a real risk of being punished, whether it's through negative media coverage, difficulty accessing capital, or even targeted short-selling campaigns.
So it's like a David and Goliath scenario.
Yeah, pretty much.
A small company going up against these Wall Street giants.
Precisely. And in most cases, David loses. But Dr. Trimbath believes there's another factor at play here too, apathy.
Apathy meaning?
Some companies just don't grasp the seriousness of the problem or how it impacts their shareholders.
That's where her work comes in.
Right.
She's not just exposing the problem, but also educating companies about the risks and the potential solutions.
Right. She wants companies to understand they have a responsibility to protect their investors and the integrity of their shares. And she argues that this can actually be in their best interest in the long run.
How so?
Well, think about it. If a company is constantly targeted by naked short sellers and their stock price is artificially depressed, it makes it harder for them to raise capital, attract talent, and even operate effectively.
Right. It creates this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
Where the company is perceived as weak, and then they become an even bigger target for manipulation.
Exactly. But if companies understand how these practices work and take steps to protect themselves, they can break that cycle. They can regain control of their narrative and their future.
So what does Dr. Trimbath advise companies to do? How can they fight back?
She encourages them to be proactive. Closely monitor their shareholder records, pay attention to unusual trading activity, and be prepared to challenge suspicious practices.
And she points to the example of Overstock, right?
Yes.
They really took on the short sellers head on.
They did. Overstock is a fascinating case study. They were one of the first companies to really push back against naked short selling in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Their CEO, Patrick Byrne, was incredibly outspoken about the issue and took concrete steps to protect the company.
I think he even sued some of the short sellers.
He did. It was a landmark case.
Yeah.
And while it didn't completely solve the problem, it sent a powerful message that Overstock wasn't going to be an easy target.
So companies can fight back.
Absolutely. But it takes courage, resources, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And that's where Dr. Trimbath's work is so crucial.
Yeah.
She's providing companies with the knowledge and the tools they need to level the playing field. Now, she's also been pretty vocal about the role of regulators in this fight, right?
Right.
Saying they need to step up and do more to protect companies from these predatory practices.
She believes regulators need to do much more. She argues the current system is too lax, the penalties are too weak, and enforcement is too inconsistent.
Which brings us back to her 4-step plan.
Right.
No waivers, hefty fines, mandatory buy-ins, and kicking out repeat offenders.
Exactly. She believes these measures are essential to creating a level playing field and restoring confidence in the market.
But she also acknowledges these changes won't happen overnight. Right?
Of course not. This is a deeply entrenched system.
Yeah.
Change will take time, pressure, and education. But Dr. Trimbath remains optimistic. She believes with enough awareness and enough people demanding change, the system can be reformed.
It's a testament to her tenacity and her belief in the power of truth. She's not giving up.
Exactly. She's not afraid to take on powerful institutions, and she's not going to back down from this fight.
It's a powerful message of hope, wouldn't you say?
It is.
That even in the face of such a daunting challenge, change is possible.
Absolutely. Dr. Trimbath is a true champion for investors and for a fairer market. She's a shining example of how one person can make a real difference in the world.
And that's why her work is so important.
Yeah.
She's giving a voice to those who've been silenced and empowering them to demand better.
Dr. Trimbath is not just an expert, she's an advocate. And her advocacy is rooted in her deep understanding of the financial system and her unwavering belief that it can be reformed to serve the interests of all stakeholders, not just the privileged few.
Her message is clear. We don't have to accept this broken system.
Right.
We have the power to demand better.
Exactly. And that's a powerful message for all of us to hear. Dr. Trimbath's work is a reminder that we're not powerless.
Yeah.
We can make a difference.
And her work is resonating with the new generation of investors, isn't it?
It is.
Especially those who are skeptical of Wall Street and the traditional financial system.
Absolutely. Dr. Trimbath's work speaks to a growing sense of disillusionment with the status quo. She's providing a framework for understanding how the system works and how it can be changed.
She's also been critical of the idea that the financial system is simply too complex for the average person to understand.
Oh, yeah. She rejects that notion completely. She believes everyone has the capacity to understand these concepts if they're explained clearly and accessibly.
And that's what she's doing right.
Yes.
Demystifying Wall Street and empowering people with knowledge.
Exactly. She's making financial literacy a priority because she understands that when people understand how the system works, they're better equipped to protect themselves and demand change.
And that's a powerful message for all of us.
It is.
No matter our level of financial expertise,
Right.
we can all benefit from Dr. Trimbath's insights and her call to action.
Absolutely. Her work is a reminder that knowledge is power, and
Yep.
that we all have a role to play in building a more equitable and transparent financial system.
You know, it's really striking how much Dr. Trimbath believes in the power of individuals to make a difference.
Yeah, she really does. She doesn't see us as just helpless bystanders in this system.
Right? She's constantly reminding us that we have agency,
Yeah.
that we can demand transparency, hold our elected officials accountable, and make informed decisions about, where we invest our money.
And she walks the walk, too. She's constantly engaging with retail investors online, answering questions and providing resources to help people become more informed.
Yeah, she's a real champion for financial literacy.
She is.
She understands that when people understand how things work, they can make better choices for themselves and their families.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about her challenging the status quo.
Oh, yeah.
She's been so vocal about this whole self-regulatory structure of Wall Street, calling it out as, a system that's just riddled with conflicts of interest.
And it's interesting how she approaches this issue.
Uh-huh.
It's not just about pointing fingers. She takes this systemic view and explains how the structure itself incentivizes bad behavior.
Exactly. It's not just about a few bad apples. It's about a system that's designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else.
And that's what makes her call for reform so compelling.
Yes.
She's not advocating for Band-Aids. She's calling for a complete overhaul.
Right.
To make the system more transparent, accountable, and equitable.
And what I find so remarkable is how effectively she communicates these ideas to a wider audience. She's really broken down the barriers between academia and the everyday investor.
She has a knack for explaining these complicated financial concepts in a way that anyone can grasp.
Yeah. Yeah.
Using clear language, relatable analogies,
Yeah.
even a bit of humor to make these topics engaging.
And she's not just writing books and lecturing.
Right.
She's actively involved in the legislative process, testifying before Congress and pushing for policy changes.
Putting her expertise into action.
Yeah, she's not content to just observe.
No.
She's rolling up her sleeves and getting right into the fight for a better system.
She's also been extremely vocal about stronger enforcement of existing regulations. Right?
Yes.
She argues that the SEC has been way too lenient on bad actors.
Mm-hmm.
And it's created this culture of impunity on Wall Street.
Yeah, and remember her 4-step plan?
Oh, yeah.
No waivers on penalties for FTDs, hefty fines, mandatory buy-ins, and kicking repeat offenders out of the system.
It's simple, but powerful.
It is.
And she doesn't shy away from naming names either.
Nope.
Calling out specific companies and individuals she believes are engaging in unethical and potentially illegal behavior.
Fearless.
Yeah, fearless in her pursuit of truth and accountability. That's what makes her work so compelling. She's not just an economist. She's a truth teller.
And she's inspiring others to speak up, too.
Right.
Encouraging whistleblowers to come forward and share what they know.
That speaks volumes about her belief in collective action.
It does.
She understands that we can't solve these problems alone.
Yeah.
We need to work together, share information, and hold those in power accountable.
She's providing the tools and the inspiration for us to do exactly that.
So listener, if you've been feeling disillusioned or powerless against this system that seems rigged against you, take heart from the work of Dr. Susanne Trimbath.
She's a shining example of how one person can make a real difference. Her work reminds us that knowledge is power, that truth matters, and that we all have a role to play in creating a fairer and more just world.
And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Dr. Susanne Trimbath. We hope you found this exploration as insightful and empowering as we have.
Remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight. The future of our financial system, and indeed our world, depends on it.